I never really followed Destiny ever since it was first announced. Sure, it's a new game made by Bungie, you know, the guys who created Halo, one of the most well-known franchises in gaming history, and even though I like the Halo series, I just didn't find myself too interested with their new game. As the years went by, however, I slowly started to gain more interest, but not enough to really hype me up for the full release. Eventually, though, I did end up pre-ordering the Destiny PS4 bundle, mainly because the bundle in itself didn't seem like a bad deal at all. Around the end of last month, Bungie opened their public beta test for Destiny, with the PlayStation versions having a few extra days of playtime compared to the Xbox versions. And because I pre-ordered that bundle, I was able to get my hands on the Destiny beta as soon as it opened up, and opted for the PS3 version of the beta. My expectations going into this weren't very high to begin with, mostly due to not really knowing what to expect. But after the first 2 days of playing the beta, I was slowly starting to realize how much fun I was actually having with the damn thing. The beta starts off with the game's character creation, allowing you to choose which of the 3 available classes you'll end up playing as. I'll go into more detail about these classes later on in the video. There isn't an obscene amount of options for altering what your actual character looks like, but it ends up not mattering a whole lot during gameplay outside of visiting the tower. Again, more on that later. Anyways, the game starts by giving some exposition on the story of Destiny, but when I watched this opening cinematic for the first time, I couldn't help but think that instead of these astronauts finding the Traveler, they ended up finding this.
Years I'm free! It's time to conquer Earth!
So you eventually get woken up by a ghost, which serves as your little personal companion in the game. And after going through a tutorial that teaches the basics of how to play, the game truly begins. The beta does throw a few more story elements at the player, but I'm not going to go into it since there isn't too much to talk about right now because, well, it's a beta. The first thing you do after the tutorial is visit that tower I mentioned earlier. This serves as the game's hub world / market district for both you and other players, where you can do things such as buy new weapons or armor, accept various bounties to earn more XP, as well as store any excess weapons or armor in a personal vault. The tower as a whole gives off the feeling of being in an MMO town, even though you're not really playing an MMO game. And this isn't the only time where Destiny feels like this, as you'll occasionally run into other players out in the battlefield whether or not they're doing the same mission. It may not truly be an MMO, but it can definitely feel like one at times. I should also mention that the visuals for this game, even for a beta, are actually pretty good, albeit not exactly mind-blowing. For a cross-gen game, the PS3 beta looked really nice in its own right, and ran really well with almost no hiccups when the action picked up. However, it should be noted that the PlayStation 4 version does look a lot better, and makes the PS3 version look slightly worse in comparison. But still, that doesn't stop the last-gen version from looking good on its own. When it came to Destiny's gunplay, however, I didn't know what to think about it when I saw footage of the game before playing the beta. Initially, I didn't think that the gunplay was going to be anything special or unique compared to every other shooter on the market. That opinion slightly changed when I actually played the damn thing. I was very pleased to find out that the actual gunplay felt very smooth and responsive. Firing each weapon felt great, and even though there's the obligatory iron sights button, the game doesn't punish you for not using them, except for the sniper rifle, which pretty much requires you to zoom in with it. I actually spent most of my first few hours in the beta not using the iron sights, and I ended up doing pretty well regardless. There were times where it almost felt like I was playing a new Halo game, which shouldn't be a surprise considering this is from the guys who made Halo, but at the same time it didn't feel too much like Halo, if that makes any sort of sense. This ended up being one of those games where it is much better to be hands-on with it than hands-off. As for the weapons themselves, there are 9 different types in total in the beta, 4 of which act as primary weapons, 3 of them as special, and 2 of them as heavy. Each class of weapons has their own separate ammo types, with heavy ammo being the most uncommon compared to the other 2. While the weapon variety in itself is decent, I do have quite a few issues with it in general. For starters, some of the weapon types are way better than others. Take the hand cannon primary for example. It's a magnum with a small clip, but it's supposed to make up for that small clip with high firepower. Yet every other primary weapon available is so much better in every way, almost to the point where the hand cannon becomes completely useless. Hopefully the final release will balance these strengths and weaknesses out, and not have certain types completely dwarf the others. Another problem I have is that the total amount of weapon types is pretty lacking in general. However, I think it was made this way due to how the weapon upgrade system in Destiny works. You see, weapons and armor in this game have different levels of rarity, with the beta only really allowing common and uncommon due to the beta's level cap of 8. Hey, Bungie, you missed your opportunity to make the level cap 7 in the beta. I thought you guys had a romantic relationship with that number. Anyways, weapons and armor with a rarity of uncommon or higher can earn experience and be upgraded to change some of its stats. The beta only teased at the extensive options available for upgrading higher rarity items, but hopefully these later upgrades can really change how each weapon type works in the final game. Thankfully, there is a little more variety in Destiny's gameplay due to the class system. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 different classes to choose from, and each one has a different subclass, which just like many other things in the beta, was only teased at due to the level cap. The Titan is a strength-based class that has a higher defense and excels at close-range combat. The Hunter is more agile but regenerates health the slowest, and is meant for fighting more at a distance. And the Warlock is the weird one, having the fastest recovery time despite being the weakest armor-wise. Each class has their own unique abilities that can be upgraded, such as the types of grenades they can throw, how their double jump functions, among many other things. The biggest difference between these classes, however, comes in the form of their supercharges, which are special abilities that deal high amounts of damage. The Titan does an area of effect slam, which can easily jam with the best. The Hunter equips a golden gun. No, really, the ability is actually called the Golden Gun, which grants 3 shots that can kill most enemies in a single hit. And the Warlock shoots a purple energy ball that has a huge blast radius. Each class and their abilities are all fun to play with, but the longer I played the beta, the more I started to realize that Warlocks actually seem to have the biggest advantage over other classes in the game, especially in Destiny's competitive multiplayer. More on that stuff later. Destiny also has random loot drops, and unlike other games of this type like Borderlands, this game features a private loot system, which means other players can't steal a weapon or armor drop. I personally like this system, as it will most likely prevent people from fighting over who deserves to keep a new weapon or piece of equipment. However, because of this system, the game also doesn't feature any sort of trading between players. The only type of trading you can do in Destiny is with another character you made on your own profile using the vault and the tower. This means that any item you stored in your vault can be picked up when you switch characters, and Glimmer, this game's version of currency, is shared between all of your personal characters. In other words, you can't give money, weapons, or armor to other players. It's a shame that there isn't going to be trading of any sort, but that may or may not change down the line. You also can't sell any weapons or armor at any shop, but you instead have to dismantle it. Dismantling items gives you a very small amount of glimmer, but it can also sometimes give you things like weapon parts that can be used to create new equipment. Single player wise, the beta offered a couple of story missions, a single strike mission which acts like a much longer story mission with multiple objectives, and the ability to roam around Earth off mission, with the option to do much smaller jobs. Each of these can be played solo or in co-op, with the exception of the strike mission, as co-op is forced on you when you select it. And thankfully, the co-op in itself is both very fun and easy to set up. Joining friends or other players is very simple to do, which is something Bungie has been very good at doing for years now, so it's great that Destiny is looking to be no different in this department. The missions themselves were fun to play through, especially in co-op, although most of them ended up being pretty short in length if you don't stray off the beaten path too much. The environments themselves are pretty large to traverse, but the game offers you your own personal speed bike which you can summon immediately once you get the ability to do so. This makes getting around the world much faster and easier, and helps the game stay at a relatively constant pace. Occasionally out of nowhere, things known as public events can happen, where you and a bunch of other players can work together to complete a certain objective. Despite being entirely optional, these events are very fun to participate in. I did notice that these events didn't happen too often, and during my playtime with the beta, the highest amount of players that participated in a public event was around 5 or 6. So I really hope more people show up and participate in these events when the final game launches. Although enjoyable, I do have a few minor complaints when it comes to both the co-op and story mission stuff. This is mostly a personal nitpick, but I wish the co-op was 4 players instead of 3. This is most likely due to the fact that Destiny only has 3 player classes to choose from, but I'm just more used to having 4-player co-op nowadays. But again, that's just me. One big issue I do have with the story missions right now is the enemy variety. I'm hoping that the full release will have more enemies to offer in general. I shouldn't be too worried since a beta can't show absolutely everything a game has to offer, but it is a legitimate concern that I have because I don't want the game to end up becoming stale really quickly. Also, there's really no penalty for dying in Destiny. The only thing that can even be remotely considered a penalty is dying in a darkness area, where respawns are disabled. If everyone dies in that area, you just start back at a previous checkpoint, and even though it says respawning is disabled, it really isn't. If you're playing in co-op, as long as one player is alive, the players who are dead can respawn in 30 seconds unless someone comes and revives you. Sure, it may be boring to wait that long, but it's a safer alternative to having everyone die and start over. So in general, the only penalty for dying in this game just amounts to a minor inconvenience at best. Then there's Destiny's version of competitive multiplayer, known as the Crucible. The beta only offered 2 maps to start with, and 1 team-based capture and hold game type to play. I was a bit skeptical at first at how Destiny's class-based gameplay would translate into a traditional multiplayer setting, and surprisingly enough, the Crucible ended up being a lot of fun. But it's not without its flaws. Like I mentioned earlier with the Warlock, both the supercharge and grenade types available to this class completely overshadows the other classes in this competitive setting, especially when these things are upgraded, and I hope this gets addressed in some sort of manner. Another game breaker during the beta was the tank-like vehicle on the moon map, which not only dealt a huge amount of damage, but also had a pretty fast fire rate. To make matters worse, each team started with one of these, which made going up against them nearly impossible at times. But thankfully, Bungie already took notice of this during the beta and is already tweaking how this vehicle works for the final release. Even though the beta only offered 2 maps at first, 2 more were occasionally available to play during the special Iron Banner events. These events were, for the most part, similar to the main Crucible matches, except for one major detail. That said detail being that weapon and armor stats are turned on. You see, in the regular Crucible matches, weapons and armor stats didn't matter, as everything in terms of damage and defense were balanced between all players to level the playing field. The Iron Banner doesn't do this, so players with better weapons and armor have an advantage against other players. Just hearing about this made me think that this event would be a complete disaster, due to the potential of being completely unbalanced. But after playing a few matches, it surprisingly wasn't terrible. The matches I played in the Iron Banner felt slightly different from the normal matches, but it never really felt like one player or team had a major advantage, but that may be due to the beta's level cap. And hell, this event even gave out special loot, so there was at least an incentive to participate in it. Too bad most rewards required level 20, so you couldn't even use them in the beta. As for the maps themselves, 2 of them were great, and the other 2 were not so great in my opinion. In terms of layout and design, both the Earth and Venus maps were well thought out and a lot of fun to play in. However, I personally wasn't a fan of the Mars map, as I didn't like how it was designed as a whole. And the Moon map, despite being the only map in the beta to support vehicles, still felt way too big for a 6 vs 6 multiplayer game. In fact, I hope that Destiny will at least have some competitive modes that support more than 12 players, so that maps like the Moon won't feel too large. But as far as I know right now, the Crucible limit is unfortunately going to be staying at 12. Despite all of my complaints and nitpicks, I ended up having a lot of fun with the Destiny beta. It ended up breaking my low expectations with how well the game actually ended up playing. Minor issues with overall polish aside. It wasn't just the gameplay that made me enjoy the beta, but I felt that it was also the actual tone of the game. Destiny didn't feel like a game that's trying to be super serious or dramatic, but it felt a bit more lighthearted than most shooters I've played recently. Maybe it has something to do with the emote system that includes a dedicated button for dancing, which, by the way, ended up being my absolute favorite part of the whole beta. Maybe it was the excellent music composed by Marty O'Donnell, which makes it even more of a shame that he was fired from Bungie during development. Or maybe it was having Peter Dinklage as your little ghost companion through the game that added to this overall tone. Whatever it was, it somehow made me enjoy this beta a lot more than I thought I would. However, I still have a bad feeling that Destiny won't live up to its massive hype. I'm not expecting it to be groundbreaking by any means, but I'm hoping that Destiny will at least provide me and my friends with hours upon hours of entertainment when I eventually get the game with that aforementioned PS4 bundle. If hope is Destiny's major theme, then I sincerely hope that I don't end up with a huge case of buyer's remorse when September 9th finally comes along.
Everywhere you look, everywhere's a heart, there's a heart. A hand to hold on to. Everywhere you look, everywhere's a place. Somebody who needs you. Everywhere you look. When you're lost out there and you're all alone, life is waiting to carry you home. Everywhere you look. Everywhere you look.
Don't test my slam jam. This is a slam jam! Ah! Welcome back, boys!